I stood there frozen. My husband looked at me with cold, emotionless eyes as I said the words I never thought I would. I don't even need you. The silence that followed was deafening, his family watching, waiting. And then he just nodded. No argument, no emotion, just agreement. At that moment, I realized the truth was far worse than I had ever imagined. We were the couple everyone envied. At least, that's what I thought. From the outside, our life was perfect. We had been together for years, built a home, shared dreams, and supported each other through everything. I used to believe that love was enough, that the foundation we built would never crack. But now, standing in front of his family, watching him nod at my words without hesitation, I questioned everything. Was it all just an illusion? I met Ethan in college. He was charming, confident, the kind of guy who made you feel like the only person in the room. He pursued me relentlessly, and when we finally got together, it felt like a fairy tale. He made me laugh, made me feel secure. I trusted him blindly. We moved in together after graduation, and soon we were married. Those early years were filled with late-night talks, spontaneous road trips, and stolen kisses in the kitchen. I never imagined anything could change. But slowly, things shifted. The warmth in his eyes started to dim, the conversations became shorter, and the once constant affection started to feel forced. At first, I brushed it off. People change, responsibilities pile up, stress gets in the way. But the distance between us grew, and I felt it like a weight in my chest. He spent more time on his phone, more nights coming home late. Whenever I asked, he had an excuse: work, gym, a night out with friends. I told myself I was overthinking, that he loved me, that he was just tired. His family adored me, or so I believed. His mother always told me I was the best thing that ever happened to Ethan. His sister and I shared inside jokes. We were close. But now, as I stood in their living room, my heart pounding, I realized how alone I really was. They watched in silence, their expressions unreadable, as if they had known something I didn't. I had just told my husband in front of everyone that I didn't need him, and he agreed. No fight, no anger, no desperation to prove me wrong, just acceptance. That was the moment I knew I had already lost him. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His nod, his lack of reaction, it haunted me. A part of me had expected him to argue, to fight for us, to at least pretend he cared. But he didn't, and that silence spoke louder than any words ever could. I started noticing the signs, the ones I had ignored for so long. His phone was always face down, locked with a new password he never shared. The late nights at work became more frequent, and when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere. I would talk to him, ask about his day, try to reconnect, but his responses were short, dismissive. It was as if I had become invisible in my own marriage. Then there were the whispers, the subtle glances exchanged between his family members when I was around. His mother, once warm and welcoming, suddenly seemed distant. His sister stopped texting as much. It was as if they all knew something I didn't, like I was the last to understand a cruel joke at my expense. One night I decided to confront him. I waited until he came home, his face exhausted, his shirt slightly wrinkled. "Ethan, what's going on?" I asked, my voice steady but my heart racing. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," I pressed. "You've changed, we've changed, and I feel like I don't even know you anymore." He hesitated, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Then, with a shrug, he said, "Maybe that's the problem." His words hit me like a slap. Maybe that's the problem. He wasn't even denying it. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced, replaying every moment, every red flag I had ignored. The way he started dressing better, hitting the gym more often. The way he seemed to be glued to his phone, texting someone with a small, almost imperceptible smile. The way he started avoiding intimacy, giving excuses, too tired, too stressed, not in the mood. I checked his phone the next morning while he was in the shower. The password had changed again. My stomach twisted. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, that I needed to dig deeper. That's when I decided I wasn't going to sit back and pretend anymore. I needed answers, and I was going to find them. I couldn't shake the feeling that my marriage was already over. I just needed proof, something concrete, something undeniable. My gut told me Ethan was hiding something or someone, and I was done ignoring it. That week, I started paying closer attention. He was always careful, never leaving his phone unattended, deleting messages instantly. But habits betray people. He would leave the room when answering calls, his voice lower, softer. He started showering as soon as he got home, something he never used to do. And then there were the unexplained receipts, fancy restaurants I hadn't been to, late-night Uber rides that didn't add up. One night after he fell asleep, I took his phone while it charged on his nightstand. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to know. The screen was locked, of course, but just as I was about to put it back, a notification popped up. A message. "I miss you. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." My hands shook as I stared at the words. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I scrolled up, scanning the last few messages before they disappeared. He had set them to auto-delete. But I had seen enough. Enough to know that my husband was in love with someone else. The next day, I followed him. It felt insane, something a paranoid wife would do. But paranoia wasn't the problem. I wasn't crazy, I was right. He told me he had a late meeting. But instead of heading to work, he drove across town to a quiet little cafe. I watched from a distance, heart hammering in my chest, as a woman slid into the seat across from him. She was beautiful, effortlessly so. They leaned in close, speaking in hushed voices, her hand brushing his casually, intimately. I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. I should have confronted him then and there, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, watching my husband smile at another woman the way he used to smile at me. When he reached across the table and tucked her hair behind her ear, something inside me snapped. That night, when he came home, I was waiting. "Did you have a good meeting?" I asked, my voice even, betraying none of the storm inside me. He barely looked at me. "Yeah, long day." I nodded, gripping my phone tightly. "That's funny because I saw you at the cafe." His entire body stiffened. His eyes finally met mine, and for the first time in months I saw real emotion, shock, panic, guilt. "You followed me," he said, voice low. I let out a hollow laugh. "That's what you're worried about, not the fact that you've been sneaking around behind my back." Silence. He didn't even try to deny it. The realization hit me like a freight train. He had already checked out of our marriage. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He had just been waiting for me to catch up. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry. I was done. The room felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just me. I stood there, waiting for Ethan to say something, anything. But he didn't. He just stared at me, jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides like a man preparing for battle. "You're not even going to deny it?" I asked, voice eerily calm. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "What's the point?" The finality in his tone shattered something inside me. All these years, all the memories, the love, the sacrifices, meant nothing to him anymore. "How long?" I whispered. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, but then he shrugged. "A few months." I scoffed, shaking my head. "And your family, do they know?" Silence. That told me everything. Of course, they knew. That's why they had been acting so distant. Why his mother had stopped inviting me over as much. Why his sister barely looked me in the eye anymore. They had been protecting him, shielding him while he betrayed me. The realization made me sick. "You let me stand there in front of your family, humiliate myself, thinking we were still." I stopped myself, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Do you love her?" His eyes darted away for just a second, but that was all I needed. "Jesus," I breathed, stepping back like I had been physically struck. "You do, don't you?" More silence. The pain in my chest was suffocating, but I refused to cry. I refused to let him see me break. "Wow," I let out a dry laugh. And here I was, thinking we just hit a rough patch, trying to fix us, trying to make you love me again when you'd already moved on. He sighed. "It's not that simple." "Actually, it is," I snapped. "You made it simple the moment you chose her over me." A long pause stretched between us. He had nothing to say because there was nothing left to say. I turned to walk away, but his voice stopped me. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said quietly. I laughed again, bitter and broken. Nobody ever does, Ethan, but you still made the choice, over and over again. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, but I refused to let my voice shake. You want to be with her? I asked. Fine, be with her, but don't you dare stand here and act like this wasn't a choice, like you fell into it, because you didn't. You walked into it willingly. He didn't argue, he just nodded. That nod, the same nod he had given me in front of his family, as if he had already accepted this fate long before I had. Something inside me broke then, but it wasn't pain anymore. It was anger. You know what? I don't even need you, I whispered, repeating the words I had said before. This time I meant them. And just like before, he nodded. That was it. No fight. No grand apology. No desperate attempt to fix things. Just a quiet agreement. I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house we had built together, out of the life I had given my everything to. And he let me go. I didn't cry that night. I thought I would. I thought I'd crumble the moment I stepped out of that house, that I'd break down in the car, unable to drive. But I didn't. I drove straight to my best friend's place, parked in her driveway, and just sat there, staring at the dashboard. My hands were still gripping the wheel like I was bracing for impact, but the crash had already happened. When I finally knocked on her door, she didn't ask any questions. One look at my face and she knew. She just pulled me inside, wrapped me in a hug, and let me breathe. The next morning, the weight of it all settled in. My marriage was over. And not in the way I had imagined, not in a screaming match or some dramatic betrayal scene. No, it ended in silence, in a nod, in a quiet, passive acceptance that he was already gone long before I ever realized it. I didn't go back home. I couldn't. Instead, I texted him. Me, *, I'll come by tomorrow for my things. Ethan, *, okay. Okay, that was all he had to say. No apology, no attempt to stop me, just * okay. I spent the day gathering myself, making a plan. I wasn't going to let this break me. I wasn't going to be the woman who begged, who held on to someone who had already let her go. The next afternoon, I walked into our house for the last time. Ethan was there, standing in the kitchen, hands in his pockets. The air between us was heavy, but neither of us spoke. I went straight to our bedroom, grabbing my clothes, my personal things. I moved like a machine, packing quickly, efficiently. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't say a word until I was nearly done. Where will you go? He asked finally. I zipped my suitcase and looked at him. Somewhere I'm wanted. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Maybe because he knew he had no right to. I took one last look around the house, the home we had built together, the memories we had made. And for the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt free. As I reached the door, I hesitated. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I had one last thing to say. You could have fought for me, I said softly. You could have tried, but you didn't, and that's how I know this was never about me. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping. I'm sorry. I nodded. Yeah, me too. Then, without another word, I walked out and didn't look back. The first night alone was the hardest. Not because I missed him. I didn't. Not really. But because I had spent years building my life around someone who had quietly walked away long before I ever noticed. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of everything sink in. I had loved him. I had believed in us. And for what? For a nod. For a man who didn't even fight for me. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this define me. I wasn't going to be another woman broken by a man who didn't deserve her. I got up, showered, and made a list. I needed a new apartment, a new routine, a new life. It was time to start over. The days passed, and with each one I felt lighter. I cut my hair, changed my number, and blocked him on every platform. Not because I was bitter, but because I refused to give him any space in my life anymore. His sister texted me once, a simple "I'm sorry." I never replied. What was there to say? She had known. They had all known, and none of them had said a word. One night, weeks later, I ran into an old friend. We grabbed coffee, talked for hours, and for the first time in a long time, I laughed, genuinely laughed. That's when it hit me. I was going to be okay, more than okay. Because the truth is, losing Ethan wasn't a loss. It was a gift. I had spent so much time trying to hold on to someone who wasn't meant for me that I had forgotten my own worth. But now I saw it. I deserved better. I always had. And if I ever doubted that, I only had to remember one thing. The night I told him I didn't need him, he nodded. And I never needed anyone who wasn't willing to fight for me. Broken heart, what would you have done in my place? Would you have fought for him or walked away like I did? Let me know in the comments below. If you love real-life stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next shocking story. Trust me, the next one is even more unbelievable. Subscribe now, because some betrayals leave scars you never see coming.